Maria never believed in ghosts. She grew up in a small town where superstitions were part of everyday life, but she always treated them with skepticism. When she heard about the abandoned house on the edge of the forest, which locals avoided, Maria decided to find out what lay behind all these scary stories. The house was old and decrepit, with a collapsed roof and an overgrown garden. According to legend, it once belonged to a wealthy family, but after the tragic death of all its inhabitants, it stood empty and abandoned. It was said that the souls of the deceased still roamed its rooms. Maria decided to spend the night in this house. She took with her a sleeping bag, flashlight, and a few candles. Entering inside, she felt a cold draft blowing down the corridor. The house was filled with the smell of dampness and mold. The floors creaked underfoot. Maria laid out her sleeping bag in the living room, lit the candles, and prepared to spend the night there. At first, nothing unusual happened. Maria read a book, trying not to pay attention to the silence around her. However, she soon began to notice strange sounds. First, it was a faint rustle, then the creaking of floorboards, as if someone was walking down the corridor. She turned off the flashlight and froze, listening. The sounds grew louder. Now they were clear footsteps approaching the living room. Maria felt her heart beat faster. She stood up, holding the flashlight ready. The footsteps stopped right behind the door. She slowly approached the door and abruptly opened it, illuminating the empty corridor. Maria decided she needed to calm down. She returned to her sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come. The sounds continued. Now they were not just footsteps, but also quiet voices whispering something indistinct. Around midnight, Maria heard a child crying. It came from deep within the house. She took the flashlight and, trembling, followed the sound. The crying led her to an old nursery. The room was covered in cobwebs, toys scattered on the floor, the crib draped in dust. In the center of the room stood a little girl in a white dress, her face hidden in shadow. Maria froze. The girl raised her head and looked at her with empty, black eyes. Maria felt an icy cold penetrate her to the bone. She stepped back, stumbling, and ran out of the room. But the child's crying did not stop now. It sounded in her head. Maria returned to the living room and hid in her sleeping bag, hoping morning would come faster. But the night seemed endless. The voices grew louder, the footsteps closer. She felt someone watching her but couldn't tell from where. The next day, Maria decided to learn more about the house and its history. She went to the town library, where she found old newspapers and records about the family who owned the house. It turned out that the house belonged to the Morgan family, wealthy and respected people. But one night everything changed. The family was brutally murdered by unknown assailants. It was said to be a ritual killing associated with occultism. Maria discovered that after the family's death, several people tried to live in the house, but all of them disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Locals believed the house was cursed, and the souls of the murdered could not find peace. Despite her fear, Maria decided to return to the house. She wanted to understand the story and help the souls find peace. She took several friends with her, hoping it would be less scary together. That night, they returned to the house and began their investigation. In the basement, they found an old book covered in dust. It was the diary of the family's head, Arthur Morgan. He described strange events happening in the house before the murders. Arthur wrote that his wife began practicing occultism, hoping to summon forces that would make them even richer. But something went wrong, and instead of wealth, they summoned an evil that consumed their souls. Maria and her friends realized they needed to perform a ritual to free the family's souls. They gathered all the necessary items and began reciting incantations from the diary. Suddenly, the house began to shake. The candles went out, and ghostly figures appeared around them, the members of the Morgan family. The ghosts looked at them pleadingly. Maria continued reading the incantation despite her fear. Suddenly, one of the figures, the girl in the white dress, approached Maria and extended her hand. Maria felt an icy chill pierce her body, but she did not retreat. When the ritual was completed, the ghosts began to disappear. The last to vanish was the girl, her face contorted in a farewell smile. The house fell silent once again. Maria and her friends left the house, feeling relieved. They believed they had helped the souls find peace. But when Maria returned home, she noticed strange things. Her house began to resemble the abandoned Morgan house. Her younger sister's toys started appearing in odd places. Whispers and footsteps returned. One night, Maria woke up to the sound of a child crying. She got out of bed and saw in the corner of the room the girl in the white dress with empty, black eyes. The girl smiled at her and said, "You think you freed us? You only opened the door." Maria realized that the evil hadn't left. It had followed her. And now her home had become the new abode for the restless ghosts. She understood that she had made a mistake by interfering in a world that should never have been disturbed. Every small town has its secrets, and ours was no exception. Behind its peaceful streets and friendly faces, a dark and sinister story lurked, known only to a few. A story I had to experience firsthand. My name is Emily, and I always thought our town was boring and mundane. Life went on as usual: school, friends, parties, nothing remarkable. But everything changed when I heard about the old abandoned house on the edge of town. The Harrison House, as it was called. Legend had it that a man obsessed with black magic lived there, and that his spirit still roamed the empty rooms. One evening, when the sun had already set, my friends and I were sitting in a cafe discussing what to do. Jake, my best friend since childhood, suggested going to the Harrison House to see if it was as scary as people said. The idea seemed exciting, though a little frightening. We gathered at the house at midnight. The building looked terrifying: peeling paint, broken windows, and a torn-off roof. But something drew us inside, like an invisible force pulling at our hands. The first thing that caught our eye when we entered was a strange inscription on the wall, written in blood-red color. "The ritual begins at midnight." We exchanged nervous glances but decided to go further. Inside, everything was covered in dust, and the air was heavy with a hint of something metallic. Jake pulled out a flashlight and suggested we split up to explore the house. I went to the second floor. The stairs creaked under my feet, and each step echoed through the empty corridors. At the end of the corridor, I found a door slightly ajar. Inside was a room filled with strange symbols and drawings. On the floor were candles, long extinguished, and an old book with creepy illustrations. I picked up the book and started flipping through the pages. It described various rituals and spells. On one page, there was an image of a circle similar to the one drawn on the room's floor. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine and turned around. No one was there, but the feeling of someone's presence lingered. Suddenly, a scream echoed from the corridor. I dropped the book and ran towards the sound. Downstairs, I found Jake standing in the center of a large hall. His eyes were full of terror, and his face was pale as chalk. "Emily, what is this place?" he whispered. I found something terrifying. He pointed to the wall, where the same circle diagram from the book was drawn. In the center of the circle lay old, almost decayed bones. We realized these weren't just drawings and symbols, it was a real altar for performing rituals. At that moment, the house came alive. Doors began slamming, windows rattled, and the walls seemed to whisper to us. We knew we had to get out immediately, but when we tried to leave, the door we entered through slammed shut in front of us. "We need to find another way out," I said, trying to stay calm. We ran to another part of the house, hoping to find a window or a back door. But the house seemed to be playing with us. Hallways grew longer, rooms changed locations, and stairs led to nowhere. When we finally reached a room on the first floor, We found an old oak door covered in cobwebs. Jake pushed it open with force, and we found ourselves in a basement. It was the creepiest place in the house. The walls were covered in symbols, and in the corner stood an old wooden table with numerous candles and ritual objects. On the table lay another book, older and more terrifying. Jake opened it and began reading aloud. With each word, the room grew colder, and the candlelight started flickering. "Jake, stop," I shouted. "You're summoning something." But he didn't listen. Suddenly, a glowing circle appeared in the center of the room, and shadows began to emerge from it. They surrounded us, and we felt the air grow thick and heavy. "This isn't an exorcism ritual," Jake whispered. "It's a summoning ritual." The shadows started closing in on us, and I felt something cold touch my skin. We were trapped, and it seemed like there was no way out. But then I remembered the last page of the book one found upstairs. It had a spell that could stop the ritual. I began reciting the words I remembered. The shadows froze, and the room filled with a strange noise like the howl of the wind. I kept going until I felt the shadows start to retreat. With each word, they grew fainter until they disappeared completely. We stood in the basement, exhausted and terrified. Jake closed the book and threw it on the floor. We ran out of the house and never returned. The Harrison house was demolished a few months after that incident, but the memories of that night haunt me to this day. I don't know what forces we awakened, but one thing I learned for sure: some secrets are better left undiscovered.